Next week will mark 10 years since Canadian Hussein Jalil was arrested and eventually sentenced to life in prison in China. Human rights groups say the terrorism charges against him were fabricated and the trial a mockery of justice. Since being imprisoned a decade ago, Hussein has had very limited access to his own lawyers, and the Canadian government's diplomatic efforts have lost steam. It's been a long 10 years for his wife and children, who worry they may never see him again. Here's Claude Adams.
Camilla carries the last image of her husband, Hussein Jalil, in her mind.
He was very generous, and then he was very, kind with the kids. He loved his boys.
It's these memories she holds on to as she goes about each day, caring for their 4 sons. Mohammed, their oldest, is 16 years old and needs help with everything.
I was alone 10 years and raised them. It's been very difficult, 10 years without him.
Ten years ago, March 2006, the Jalils were in Uzbekistan visiting family. After breakfast one morning, Hussein left the family home to run a simple errand and never came back.
Tell me about the last time that you saw your husband.
I have never thought, I have never seen him again. I have never thought. I thought he's gonna come back after a couple of hours.
Late that night, Camilla would learn Hussein had suddenly been arrested. In the months that followed, he was accused of being a terrorist and sent to China to face the charges.
He has never done that kind of things. He has never.
Camilla was confused and unsure of what to do next. Not knowing if she would ever see him again, she returned to Canada.
It was really difficult when you are leaving someone your loved ones behind, and then with 3 kids, and then I was pregnant that time. It was really difficult. It was a really bad day.
From that day on, Camilla had to become more than a single mother. She was forced to become an advocate, the voice for her family, fighting to keep Hussein's story alive.
Hi, my name is Camila, and then I'm Hussein Jalil's wife.
China accused Hussein of terrorism, and in a trial that was shrouded in secrecy, he was sentenced to life in prison.
It was terrible. It was terrible.
Hussein's lawyer in Canada, Chris MacLeod, heard rumors of possible torture, a confession, and long stretches in solitary confinement.
For a Canadian citizen to somehow be captured, detained, tortured, and have no access to Canadian government, for that person to be facing those sorts of human rights abuses is a particular affront to Canadian government of Canada.
MacLeod launched an appeal. He wanted evidence and documentation, things most lawyers would expect in a fair trial. But getting access to Hussein was impossible.
When you're blocked from entering a courtroom, when you have no participation, speaking to your office and asking for court documents, well, there are none in our possession because we've had no access. Canadian government has had no access to any of the proceedings.
The Chinese say Hussein's case is an internal affair, and MacLeod says they haven't let any Canadian officials visit him in prison.
Lack of transparency is really an understatement. It's beyond lack of transparency. There has been overt efforts to block any access to Canadian government officials.
China's actions have been challenged by human rights groups. They say Hussein is not a terrorist, but a political prisoner, and he deserves a fair trial.
What did he do? What did he do that's so bad?
Yeah, that's the... Every day I ask a question for myself, what he has done. Did he hurt someone? That's, you know, he had just speech, strong speech. Strong,
He was outspoken.
Yes, outspoken. He had a very strong speech to, you know, put his people's right.
Hussein's people, the Uyghurs, have struggled for decades in violent clashes with Chinese authorities.
They're a Muslim minority and have experienced long decades of harsh repression at the hands of the Chinese government.
Alex Neve is the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada. He says Hussein was a leader within his community, and that put him on Chinese radar.
Individuals who seek to promote the rights of the Uyghur people, who speak out about concerns about Chinese policies, are regularly harassed and very frequently are tried on trumped-up charges.
In the 1990s, China cracked down on street protests, continuing a strategy of tight controls made famous in Tiananmen Square. Back then, leaders like Hussein became a target. He was arrested and spent time in a Chinese jail.
I gather the Chinese considered him a little bit more than just an outspoken activist, didn't they?
They say he's a terrorist, that he's a secessionist. Their worst crime that they say is that he sought a sovereign or separate state for the Uyghur people.
Hussein eventually fled from China and met Camilla. Together, they started a family and made their way to Canada.
He was a guy who came to Canada, believed in what Canada could offer. You know, great Canadian success story in the sense they came here and were building a new life.
It's a life Camilla has put on hold for almost a decade.
One of your children has never seen his father.
Yeah, my youngest one. And now he's 9.5 years. He hasn't seen his dad. He hasn't talked to him, you know? Which is, it's really bad. It hurts a lot. It hurts. My heart, you know, breaks. My heart breaks when I don't know, I cannot explain it. Sorry about that.
It's an agonizing process for Camilla, piecing together bits of the story as they trickle in.
Camilla back here in Canada has at best only had morsels of occasional and often very incomplete information about what's the state of his health, how is he being held, what are his prison conditions like.
She knows Hussein is still alive, and that gives her the strength to keep pushing.
I'm saying as a Canadian, I'm saying as a human, he's missing all his rights, you know. He hasn't seen anyone from the consulate.
To Camilla, Hussein was a fearless man who cared deeply about his people. Now, she's asking the Canadian government to fight for its citizen with the same conviction she remembers in Hussein.
I don't want to say they haven't done anything. They tried, but you know, they haven't tried enough.
Consular services deal with over 1,000 arrests and detentions abroad each year. But Amnesty International says Hussein's case, with such egregious human rights violations, should be a top priority.
When there's a Canadian citizen who is imprisoned in a political context, who has experienced a deeply unfair trial, how that cannot be something that our Minister of Foreign Affairs doesn't take seriously, that would be very, very troubling.
They can't just let this go. This man was a Canadian.
We believe that China has not lived up to the Canada-China consular agreement. I'll be raising this matter next week in China, Mr. Speaker.
In very early days, there was quite a bit of high-level action on Hussein Khalil's case.
In those early days, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper brought up Hussein's case with high-ranking Chinese officials.
A very frank discussion with President Hu of China.
But some critics say that strategy failed, and over the years, the urgency to bring him home has faded.
You almost got a sense that once the sentence had been imposed, there was almost a bit of giving up.
Giving up on Hussein must not happen, Neve says, if he is to have any hope of coming home.
It's up to the Canadian government to decide which cases they will take up, which cases they will ignore.
There is no explicit obligation on Canada to provide consular services to its citizens, even when their human rights are violated overseas. That's something Amnesty International is fighting to change.
There needs to be clarity, there needs to be consistency, and there needs to be some rights involved.
Canadians want to know that the government has their back when they travel overseas.
A blunt question, are we doing enough?
We could always do more. Yeah, I don't want to make that sound too political, but we could always do more.
We asked Global Affairs Canada what more they plan to do for Hussein. They declined an interview and would only provide an email statement. Mr. Hussein Khan Jalil's case remains important to the Government of Canada and continues to be raised at senior levels. We continue to call upon the Chinese government to permit Canadian officials to conduct a consular visit to monitor Mr. Jalil's well-being. For Camilla, the last month brought a small bit of hope. There are reports out of China that Hussein's sentence was reduced from life to 20 more years.
We didn't expect. We were surprised. And then that's why we don't want to give hope and then just keep pushing.
But even that can't be confirmed. So for Camilla, it's a struggle to remain optimistic.
Well, you know, we miss him a lot. We miss him a lot, and then, you know, we are missing him every single day.
The legal options are almost exhausted, and the promises of diplomacy remain unfulfilled. But there is one thing Camilla is still counting on.
Maybe someday it's going to be, you know, a miracle. Maybe we can bring him back where he belongs.
Next, suing the government for a deadly accident.
WorkSafe knew or ought to have known that combustible dust was a hazard.
There needs to be accountability on WorkSafe, who basically left us in there to burn.
Each day, caring for their 4 sons. Mohammed, their oldest, is 16 years old and needs help with everything.
I was alone 10 years and raised them. It's been very difficult, 10 years without him.
Government's diplomatic efforts have lost steam. It's been a long 10 years for his wife and children who worry they may never see him again. Here's Claude Adams.
Camilla carries the last image of her husband, Hussein Jalil, in her mind.
He was very generous, and then he was very, you know, kind with the kids. He loved his boys.
It's these memories she holds on to as she goes about each. 10 years ago, March 2006, the Jalils were in Uzbekistan visiting family. After breakfast one morning, Hussein left the family home to run a simple errand and never came back.
Next week will mark 10 years since Canadian Hussein Jalil was arrested and eventually sentenced to life in prison in China. Human rights groups say the terrorism charges against him were fabricated and the trial a mockery of justice. Since being imprisoned a decade ago, Hussein has had very limited access to his own lawyers, and the Canadian government